Welcome back, AP, and welcome back to this beautiful face that only a mother can love. Look at that bad boy. That's Jeremy Bentham's jerky head, but actually it's not. It's a replica. The actual head itself only gets brought out on special occasions because they don't want it to degrade too much. But this is like a replica of what the head looked like, and there's all these myths and stories about it, so it was a lot of fun. I'm really glad that y'all enjoyed the Jeremy Bentham stuff. But the big thing about Jeremy Bentham was his whole idea of utilitarianism, right? Being an English philosopher and the idea that we should do the best possible good for the most possible people. It's going to dramatically change the effects of the industrial movement on the state of Victorian-era London and lead forward into an idea of sanitation, into an idea of saving as many lives as possible, into the ideas of electricity for all and fresh water for all and things like that, right? So the thing about it, though, going forward that you need to understand is he's going to have multiple disciples that are going to have to deal with this theory, okay? So don't even write Edwin Chadwick down yet, but that's one of his main disciples. So the big thing that comes up is this thing known as miasmatic theory, okay? So everybody before Jeremy Bentham, everyone back to when Galen was around, and whenever his ideas start to go away, and William Harvey's like, the heart's a pump, blah, blah, blah. Now, the thing going into it, though, that you need to understand is that basically for a really, really long time, people genuinely believed miasma is how you got sick, right? And miasma, or a miasmatic theory, is the idea that wretched stink and fumes from bogs and cesspits is what gives you sickness. That by, like, sniffing in these fumes, and it's all airborne, and that's how you get sick, right? Now, are they completely wrong? No. Are they very wrong? Yes. All right, so, and a lot of this goes down to the fact that these origins and ideas of miasma and stuff like that definitely equate to the idea of like, oh, and poor people live closer to these wretched bogs and pits. That's why they get sick more than anybody else. And that's why when the plague happened, we all moved out into the countryside if we had the money to go out there, and then we didn't die, right? So, like, miasma was a common sense connection. Miasma was this idea of this dark looming cloud of stench and grossness that affects only poor people and not wealthy people, right? And so, oh, poor people, if you just get a job and move far away from these wretched pits and bogs, you won't get sick as much. Wow, thanks a lot. Yeah, great idea to stopping sickness. But as we already know, the back-to-back housing, those cesspits are growing, right? The back-to-back housing, sanitation is disgusting. People are selling their own poop as fertilizer. So gross, right? So now, looking the entire thing, though, a discipleship is going to show up, and many people begin to break the mold of the miasmatic theory, okay? So one of the earliest ones is this guy, Edwin Chadwick, right? Which is the most English-sounding name I've ever heard. Edwin Chadwick. I expect all of you to be coming into, class tomorrow and be like, oh, tip-top cheerio, tea and crumpets, Edwin Chadwick. All right, Edwin Chadwick is a very important figure, just a lot like Jon Snow. And not Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, but the actual Jon Snow, right? Now, I always talk about Edwin Chadwick because I feel like his is a little bit more interesting, but you can also look up Jon Snow as well if you're looking for something else that's also along those lines. But Edwin Chadwick and Jon Snow really had to deal with one particular disease that's going to start to break everyone away from the miasmatic theory. That disease is known as cholera, right? So, now what ends up happening, though, is this whole process begins when Edwin Chadwick is an English government official in charge with the idea of pauper relief, right? So the English government under Victoria, very young Victoria, under Victoria is going to decide that they are going to need to start figuring out a way to relinquish and to lighten up the entire idea of what is going to be known as the poor problem, or the problem of the poor, right? So he actually shows up with the Poor Laws in 1834, about 3 years before Victoria ever takes over. Right now, Victoria is alive, but the thing about it is Victoria is not quite like, how do I put this? Victoria is not queen yet, but she is going to be very soon, okay? And he is in charge underneath her father, William IV, trying to figure out how do we make it so all these people in these poorer areas are not disgusting and dying and gross and everything else, right? So he comes up with these concepts known as the Poor Laws in 1834, and he also realized something very important, that the death of a wage earner will crush a family income. So the goal needs to be to figure out how to ward off disease, right? We don't want figures of wage earners to die because that's going to actually lead people to being more poor. So how do we keep them from dying? Let's figure out how we stop one of these big looming diseases that's always breaking out, cholera, right? So, and he realizes with Jon Snow, who is a reporter and an actual university student, Jon Snow realizes that so much of this stuff does not come from miasma. It's coming from the fact that water sources are contaminated, and they're contaminated due to the fact there's all this literal human grossness everywhere, right? And so the big thing is before Edwin Chadwick shows up, people literally had to be tasked with what Rufino said in class, going out with trucks and shovels and scooping up human waste matter and putting it into a truck and taking it away. Edwin Chadwick realizes that it actually is 1/20th of the cost to remove that gross, nasty, vile human waste via sewers rather than having someone scoop it up. And the bad and sad and pathetic thing is that the Romans figured this out over 1,000 years before the English ever did. 1,300 years before, actually no, almost 2,000 years before the English ever figured out, oh, let's get the duty out of our city. So the Romans actually had figured this out anyway. This right here is an ancient Roman sewer that was actually dug underneath Rome before the birth of Christ, right? So that is ridiculous. Ancient Roman sewers, ancient Romans knew, get this stuff out of here, it can make people sick. And then what ends up happening though is Edwin Chadwick shows up and basically recreates them, but makes them more efficient and uses new types of material. He is going to instead use metal basins and subway tiles to actually be able to get them out. So you see this right here, these little plates, they're ceramic tiles to actually allow the water to cleanly flow out and wash away all of the waste, right? So Edwin Chadwick comes up with this concept, and it's absolutely genius because Chadwick said that iron pipes and tiles are really cheap. They're so cheap to be able to just flow the stuff out of here, and then we don't have to pay people to do it, and we're going to end up saving a lot of lives. And so sewage systems were the answer. Cholera broke out again in 1846, right? Right around 1846, you're seeing the cholera outbreak right there, okay? So cholera breaks out in this entire period. His report becomes the basis of health law by 1848. Sanitary systems following this outbreak are going to advance, and these ideas are going to spread to the continent. Remember, it all moves in waves, right? So, the big thing is out of Victorian-era England. This is by the time that Victoria has taken over as a young monarch. She, actually endorses these new ideas of systems and sanitation systems under Chadwick that so many parliamentarians gave him pushback on. They called it sanitary nonsense, right? And then Edwin Chadwick's iron pipes and subway tiles saved lives. Because as sewage systems popped up, death rates began to decline, right? So look at the decline of death rates in the thousands throughout the continent following the induction of some of these different sanitation systems. That's ridiculous. Look at the giant drop-off right here, bink, and then it ends up going down as well. Now that's one element to try and figure out to stop one disease, right? So the one disease they were trying to get out in front of was cholera. And cholera literally dehydrates the human body so much that your blood gets so thick that it ends up killing you, right? So now they realized though that cholera was coming from contaminated water sources. So they're like, oh, let's try to figure this out and let's make these subway tiles and sewage systems there so that we can literally remove this waste, right? We'll remove this waste and we'll actually save thousands of people. Genius concept. Now, that's one disease, though, cholera. You've had all these other diseases for so long, like diphtheria, typhoid, typhus, all these other ones, and they're not caused by infected water. So a lot of scientists start scratching their noggin, and they're like, well, if we know that infected and vile water causes cholera, is there a chance that there are other things going on? And the death of the miasmatic theory basically happens because of these three guys, right? Louis Pasteur is one of the very first ones that shows up and realizes that there are little critters inside of all kinds of stuff. The air, the water, our food, everywhere, right? And so Louis Pasteur is a scientist that actually worked at a brewery in Germany for several years, right? And while he was working at that brewery, he used a microscope and started looking at yeast cells and other different kinds of slides. And he realizes, wait a minute, the yeast cells die if you try to pitch them into beer too soon. So Louis Pasteur comes along with this idea, and he's like, wait a minute, why can't we just brew beer when the water is hot? And he was throwing yeast cells into very hot water, and the yeast cells were all dying. And he was like, wait a minute, if there are other organisms out there like yeast cells, right, bacteria that might get us sick, we could clean them and kill all of those bacteria by heating the liquid to boiling point and actually sterilizing the product. This dude basically discovered the concept of germs. That's insane. So he actually realizes that the concept of spontaneous generation is wrong. And spontaneous generation is the idea that like you spontaneously are generating sickness along with the miasmatic theory, right? Spontaneous generation is wrong. This is going to pioneer the ideas of vaccines. It's going to give credence to Lester's idea of vaccines and using other microorganisms to kill other microorganisms, right? And it's going to lead prominently to the idea of germ theory, right? Germ theory is the idea that diseases were caused by the spread of tiny little living organisms rather than actually, and they can be controlled and they can actually be like really, really focused on. Now, the problem after Louis Pasteur was you figured out how to get rid of bacteria in water and, you know, like cook it out and kill it that way and things like that. And you could do it with milk, right? That's why milk is heavily pasteurized now to try and make it so there's no bacteria inside of that when it's coming out of like the actual cow, right? I know that, you know, McKenna's not worried about that at all. She's like, I don't drink milk. But like now the big thing about it though is germ theory is going to be one step in the right direction. But like I said, all three of these guys contributed to the growth of the bacterial revolution. The next guy that shows up is Robert Koch. And Robert Koch is a German scientist who really literally realizes how to grow and culture bacteria, helping lead to the example of like actual antibiotics and vaccines. He basically invented the petri dish in his bacterial tubes before the petri dish ever even existed. Now the petri dish is invented by another scientist named Petrie, but like literally like it has food for the bacteria and will grow up much faster. But Robert Koch realized you could grow bacteria inside of these tubes. So these tubes actually give you the ability to grow bacteria, culture it, and study it to figure out how to kill it, right? So like that's a massive leap forward. And then Joseph Lister comes along, who is an English scientist who realizes that, dude, what have we been doing? If there's bacteria on our hands, in our food, in our water, it's gotta be also on the tools that we're operating on people with. So he comes up with a process of sterilization and sterilizing hospital equipment and sterilizing the items that are actually going to be in touching a human body, especially in the medical field, right? So the idea of these ideas combined together, and diphtheria, typhoid, typhus, cholera, yellow fever, they all slowly start to disappear. And that's when we get to that back into that graph where the death rate is just dropping like a rock, right? That is one massive element to this whole thing. But another big element to this whole thing is the redesign of cities, right? So what the English figured out the hard way, and they actually did this for once. We've got the English doing something after everybody else. I know that sounds mind-blowing, but we have something coming on like after everybody else. So the thing you need to understand, though, is that England did not develop their cities as fast as the continent. So there is this guy that is super important. Two guys, actually. One is Napoleon III. And Napoleon III, the new president of France following the revolutions of 1848, decides that he wants to use public projects to aid and employ the poor, right? He's like, what if we literally as a government built things, right? Like what if we laid the railroads ourselves? What if we had new items built inside of cities? And that will directly help us actually employ some of these poorer people, which is going to be some of the earliest forms of the welfare state, right? Now, he hires a German man to come along named Baron George, or I can't say his name in German, Baron de Haussmann, okay? Everybody calls him Baron de Haussmann. Baron de Haussmann is a German architect hired by Napoleon III to create some of these projects, right? And what Baron de Haussmann comes up with is literally the archetype for every single European city going forward, right? We want to get rid of all those images that you had in your mind in class yesterday, and Baron de Haussmann is the guy that we thank for that, right? Those images of Victoria-era London being like everything's wet and sticky, right, Goday? And then everything also, there's all the smoke in like the air right between, and then like what Sabito said, really narrow alleyways, and there's all these people up above me and stuff like that. We want to get rid of that image, and we want to create an image that looks more like this, right? So like, and how do we do that? Baron de Haussmann comes along and he decides that he is going to rebuild France, particularly starting with Paris, right? He is responsible for the archetype of Paris that you know of today. The way that Paris looks today and the way that most European cities look today is a Haussmann development, right? He destroyed old buildings to create new, huge, broad streets that would be lined with trees to create better flow. He demolished slums, which stinks because he's moving people out of where they live, but still, demolished slums and actually had and old fortress walls, which are really important as well. So remember, one of the constant problems of Europe were there were these old medieval walls that fenced the city in, right? And they fenced the city in, and people that had to settle outside of them were like actually sparsely spread out, or everybody in the middle was jammed in on top of each other. He has those walls destroyed, and around the edges of them, instead of that wall being there, he has these giant ringed boulevards. So you can actually go all the way around the city and cut in when you need to. And a boulevard as in a very large street, right? And we'll actually see one like right here, for example, the Champs-Élysées is one of the very, very most popular ones. And we'll look at one in a little bit. But the ringed boulevards of these cities literally actually make it so you can go around them, and they improve infrastructure, and they also improve traffic to help move people around in their horse-drawn carriages much faster and more efficiently, right? So like also parks, open areas, sewers, aqueducts, public transportation by horse carts, and by 1890, we got electric streetcars starting to show up, right? Baron de Haussmann is going to take Paris from looking like this, right? Like this is Paris before Haussmann. Notice how jammed it is, crammed it is, on top of everybody it is. This is also Paris before Haussmann. This is Paris actually right before the revolutions of 1848. Narrow. This right here is a bridge that someone would walk over. That's not a bridge. That's a plank of wood, right? Like so, like you've got all these different nasty things going on. Look at this. Look at the slums of Paris, like following the revolutions of 1848. But then Haussmann comes along, and he wants to end this is a big thing too. Keep this in the back of your mind. We'll talk about this in class. But there's another big ulterior motive Napoleon III had to hiring Haussmann, right? Look at these bad barricades right here. But we'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? Now, like so. But this is what he wants it to look like instead. There's the Champs-Élysées, right? So like the Champs-Élysées, the ringed boulevard that will help traffic. Notice he demolished an entire area of roads so he could build a nice long Broadway. And he also standardized the height of buildings, right? The buildings in many of these European cities would be like, no, you cannot build over these heights because we want to have a uniform height to all the buildings themselves. All of the facades had to actually match one another. And you end up now moving into a society that looks more like this. No duty in the streets. We now have people moving around, walking, talking, enjoying shops, and a day out on the town. The beauty that is European cities is unrivaled. And I'm sorry, it just is. All right, so like when you get to Europe one day, you'll notice what I'm talking about. The giant, massively beautiful thing that is Haussmann reforms spreads all over the continent, and everyone starts doing the Paris thing and starts developing their cities in this manner, right? Vienna does it soon, and then this right here is what modern Paris looks like with its really long tree-lined broadways and its way to easily move and efficiently like go throughout the city. Love it, right? So like now, big thing though, okay? So we talked about the bacterial revolution, how cities are going to change. We talked about the death of like the miasmatic theory, right? Edwin Chadwick. We talked about Edwin Chadwick, Pasteur, Koch, Lister, Haussmann, Napoleon III, right? So we were talking about a lot of people in this. But now what about everybody else, right? What about everybody else? What about the rich, the poor, and everybody in between, right? So like the biggest thing that you need to understand coming out of the first industrial revolution and going into this period of time, the middle class is still the smallest class, right? Still the smallest class. They make up far less than 20% of all of the like entirety of the class breakdown, right? The middle class is still very, very small, and the wealthy upper class still controls most of the like country's income, right? The richest 20% of the population still accounts for over 50 to 60% of its national income, right? That's leaving only 40%-ish for the middle class and the urban poor to basically fight over, right? So like the biggest thing though also is the middle is still very small, but the upper is barely larger than they are, right? So like, and the only reason the upper class is bigger is just because they've been there longer. And also because the middle class is being chopped out of the lower class, right? So around 75% of all people were still considered though lower class, right? So you've got 75% of people still considered lower class. You've got less than 20% of people are now going to be considered like middle class, and a little bit more is going to be considered upper class, right? And they accounted for about less than 20% of the national income. So what I'm trying to get at with all these crazy numbers is the fact that, as you can see, the gap between the wealthy and the poor is not only big, but it's growing, right? It's getting farther and farther away. Because as the middle class begins to claim some of this wealth from the upper class, they're going to hoard it inside of their own businesses, and that's still going to keep growing further and further distant away from one another, right? And the classes are even going to start like splitting up a little bit. You're going to end up with like an upper middle, a middle, a lower middle, an upper lower, and a lower, right? So like now the thing about it though also is, granted, the standard of living is increasing for the average person, but a lot of that has to do with prerogatives and motivations, right? Why would the upper class and the middle class finally like the ideas of Edwin Chadwick, Pasteur, Koch, Lister, Baron de Haussmann? Because it benefits them. Remember, the middle and the upper class is not going to do anything if it does not benefit them. They're not doing this for the poor. They're doing this to keep the poor alive, to make it so they can easily now get to work, right? So they can actually go to work and they can actually get to their factories and they have an easier way of going about it and not having to worry about dying from cholera at any minute, right? So yes, the standard of standard of living is increasing, but slums still existed. So this slide is really, really important to say that the plight of the poor, it's not like everyone looked like that guy with his umbrella and his top hat. The slums were still very much there, right? And the rich also still don't pay much in taxes. So for however reasonable these cities are changing, they're getting cleaner, they're getting nicer. There's still this really terrifying little thing going on. And it's called poverty, right? So now we focus first on the middle class, right? So when we're talking about these two different classes and going into the second industrial revolution and how everything's changing, the middle class is going to have a dramatic change in a lot of different ways. But like I said, they're going to start splitting up, right? So you're going to end up with a stratified middle class into three different levels, right? You got the upper middle, which is the business owners and the factory owners. You got the middle, which is a very diverse kind of weird little place where small factory owner and small businesses occur, right? So going into it, right up here, these guys are your different levels of white-collar workers, right? So business owners and factory owners are white-collar workers, and I'll explain that whole thing, but it has to do with men's fashion. So during the late 1800s, if you had enough money to afford a collared shirt, your collar actually attached to your shirt. It wasn't connected. So you see how my collar is actually connected to my shirt? I would be considered lower class in the late 1800s of Europe because my collar is attached to my shirt. Most men, if you were wealthy enough, right, especially your middle-class people, your white-collar workers, actually attached their collar to their shirt physically, right? They actually picked it up and then put a button on it and attached it. That's why it was a different color than the rest of your shirt, right? And it indicated the fact that you might have been a business owner or a factory owner, or a small business owner or a small factory owner, or a supervisor or a shopkeeper, right? So you're seeing the different levels of stratification going on. And the other big thing that you're going to see happening is the middle class are going to start trying to emulate the upper class, right? They're going to start copying the upper class, and the middle class is going to start growing very, very public. They're going to start having dinner parties of their own. Their socialization levels is going to begin to increase. And they're doing this in the hopes of growing their businesses, becoming more of an abject form of society. And also, keep in mind, they might be the smallest, but they're still the fastest growing, right? And they're beginning to take up a lot of space in society. So their socialization is going up. Their fashion is dramatically changing. They are beginning to hire servants and actual governesses and maids and not mistresses and seamstresses that live in their house. They are beginning to educate their children. They are also adopting very strict hierarchical morals and decorum, and they're basically just trying to imitate the entire upper class. Now, speaking of fashion, this is going to be a big thing that we're going to talk about tomorrow. This is the fashion of the 1700s. This right here is the fashion of Marie Antoinette, right? Her entire ladies in waiting. Notice the giant bustle dresses, the huge hoop skirts and stuff like that actually had giant pieces of metal built into them that made it very difficult to walk, but it demonstrated your wealth because of its multiple different layers and all of its different components, right? This right here is a good example of a ridiculous dress that costs so much money. And I bet some of y'all are sitting there wondering, okay, that's the 1700s fashion? How'd you go to the bathroom? Well, so fun fact is that women's fashion was so restrictive, especially in the upper classes, and then now, of course, in the late 1700s, that this is how they actually went to the bathroom in the 1700s. This thing is called a bordaloo. They would literally have to be standing, and they had to go into a corner in a different room and go to the bathroom in this thing. It's about the size of a gravy boat. It's only about yay big. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in class. But as you can tell, that women's fashion was meant to broadcast and demonstrate wealth rather than being functional. But look at how fashion is changing going into the late 1800s. No more giant bustles. No more huge, metal structures inside of our dresses and stuff not our dresses, I'm not wearing one, but, inside of the dresses anymore. Now women can get up and sit down. They can easily ride a horse in one of these, which was a mind-blowing factor to so many people, right? So, and it's becoming something that you can actually get out and go out in, right? Something that maybe the actual bustle thing is only in the back, so you can easily move around and be sociable and be a socialite. And then also, women's working fashion was getting much more intense. These are the things that women might go and actually work a job in, right? Might actually go and become more avidly involved in society in, right? Which is massively important because women's rights are changing very, very much so, right? So now looking at it, actually, let's do a head. Nope, let's not do that. Wait. Sorry about that. I got a couple more slides and we're done, okay? So now, women, of course, are going to be taking a bigger, swath of societal responsibilities, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. Also, the lower class is going to begin to be split up very aggressively, right? So the lower class, though, is not going to be stratified like the middle. It's just going to be stratified by two levels. You're going to have your upper workers, which are your workers that are on the cusp of becoming middle class. They're known as the labor aristocracy, right? Skilled workers, they had moral standards, and they were the earliest leaders of labor reforms, right? There are future communists. That's what you need to keep in the back of your mind. And then your lower workers are your semi-skilled and unskilled laborers, which are very, very diverse and extremely unorganized, right? So they are the ones that all the middle class was always afraid they're going to be voting with their stomachs. This is your lower, this is your lower class, right? Notice the top hats and the attempt to actually emulate the middle class above them. You're going to see gatherings and organizings pop up much more as well. You're going to see, for example, taverns and pubs are now going to be open to women, and they're actually going to be allowed to go inside of them, and they're going to be wearing these new fashions that they can actually go out in the streets in, right? And they're going to be meeting for places for political organizations. That's going to be a big thing as well. Sports and music are becoming favorite pastimes. Local areas are actually organizing teams that are going to have massive influx into society a little bit later. But yeah, we're actually having different neighborhoods and cities pop up with their own soccer teams and stuff like that, and everybody's beginning to actually enjoy going and watching them. Cricket becomes a massively popular sport also in England, and then also going forward, lastly, is a big one. Church attendance is starting to go down. But that is where we're going to leave off, and we'll talk about the rest of that stuff very soon in class, and I'll see y'all soon.